It was just past 7 a.m. in the sleepy town of Brookridge when Henry Talbot, a mailman of 22 years, was bitten by a dog. Not just any dog, a filthy, wild-eyed stray that came out of nowhere and sank its teeth into his uniform like it had something to prove. Most people would have fought back or called animal control. Henry? He chased it. And thank God he did. Henry wasn't the kind of man to rattle easily. He'd spent over 2 decades delivering letters, birthday cards, and overdue bills to every front porch and country mailbox in Brookridge, Ohio. A town so quiet, the only thing louder than the cicadas were the whispers at church potlucks. He knew every cracked sidewalk, every dog behind every white picket fence, and which kids liked to sneak peeks into his mail satchel hoping for comic books from Amazon. That morning, as usual, Henry had already stopped at the Gas and Go for his coffee and blueberry muffin, greeted old Mr. Lawson by the barber shop, and started his usual route down Timber Lane Road. The sun was barely up, painting the sky a warm orange. Everything was routine, until it wasn't. Henry had just dropped off mail at the Harmon residence, a small blue ranch-style house with a squeaky gate, when he felt it. A sudden tug on his pant leg, sharp, violent, then teeth. "Hey, what the hell?" he yelled, stumbling backward and almost dropping his satchel. The attacker was lean, matted, and smelled like rotting leaves. A stray. No collar, no tags, mud-streaked fur. And most unsettling, those eyes. Not wild, not angry, but intent, urgent. The bite hadn't broken skin, just tore his pants and left a nasty bruise. But what unsettled Henry the most was what happened next. The dog didn't run away. It barked, loud, sharp, almost commanding, then jogged 10 feet down the street, stopped, and turned back to him. Barked again. Waited, like it expected him to follow. "Crazy mutt," Henry muttered, rubbing his leg. He looked around. No one else was out yet. No joggers, no dog walkers, just him and the stray, locked in some weird game of red light, green light. It barked once more. Louder. Sharper. Then it ran, down the road, past the hedgerows, toward the tree line that bordered Mill Creek. And here's the strange thing. Henry followed, not because he had to, not because he thought it made any sense, but because deep down, something told him this wasn't random. This wasn't just a stray with a screw loose. This dog was trying to tell him something. The path wasn't easy. Still sore from the bite, Henry jogged across uneven grass, hopping over a rusty wire fence and into the thicket that separated Timber Lane Road from the woods. He kept catching glimpses of the dog, its tail, its back legs, just enough to stay on its trail. Branches scratched his arms. Mud soaked his socks. The woods were thick with that early morning humidity that clung to your skin like syrup. "Where are you going?" he grumbled aloud, to himself more than anything. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a high-pitched whimper, not a bark, not the dog. It sounded like a baby? He stopped cold. "No way," he muttered, scanning the trees, then looking toward the shallow ditch that ran parallel to the woods. And there the dog was, standing perfectly still at the edge of the ditch, tail rigid, ears perked, eyes fixed on Henry. It barked again, but not angrily, just desperately. Henry moved closer, brushing aside overgrowth, slipping slightly as he reached the edge. At first he didn't see anything, just leaves, trash, and tangled weeds. Then movement, subtle, barely visible. A corner of faded pink fabric shifting between the rocks and grime. "Oh my God," he whispered, kneeling. It was an infant, maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a dirty blanket, face damp with sweat and soil. The baby's tiny fingers twitched weakly. Henry felt his throat close. The adrenaline hit like a truck. He yanked his phone out, hands trembling as he called 911. His voice cracked as he gave the dispatcher directions. He wrapped the baby in his jacket, checking her breathing. It was shallow, weak. The dog stood guard beside them both, tail wagging faintly now. as if it knew its mission was almost over. Halfway through the call, Henry looked at the dog and whispered, "You're not just a stray, are you?" And right there, under the rising sun and the dew-damp trees, Henry felt something shift, not just in him, but in how he saw the world. This wasn't about a dog biting a man. This was about a dog saving a child. If you believe animals are more than just pets, if you believe they're heroes, subscribe to our channel, Heroes for Animals. We share true stories just like this every week. By the time paramedics arrived, the baby was wrapped, warm, and conscious. Barely. The EMTs said they were minutes from something irreversible. The sheriff came next, then reporters, then chaos. But the one who did not seem fazed at all? The dog. It sat beside the ditch calmly, like it had done this before. Like it had been waiting for someone to finally listen. Later that day, as Henry sat on the tailgate of his truck, baby safe in a hospital crib, he stared at the dog lying beside him. It had no name, no home, just a mission it refused to abandon. Henry took a long breath, then said, "You saved her, didn't you?" The dog thumped its tail against the truck bed once, maybe twice. Henry smiled. "You want to come home with me?" The wind picked up slightly, pushing through the thinning trees, rustling leaves that had just begun to dry and curl with the early whispers of fall. Henry Talbot, limping slightly from the earlier bite, trudged past the wire fence and onto uneven ground he hadn't stepped on since he was a teenager sneaking out to fish with his buddies. Ahead of him, the stray dog, still filthy, still wide-eyed, barked once, short and firm, then disappeared into the woods like it knew exactly where it was going. "This is insane," Henry muttered, brushing a thorny branch away from his face. "Completely insane." But he didn't stop. He didn't even consider stopping. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was instinct. Something deep in his chest that told him flat out that whatever was happening here, it mattered. More than a torn uniform, more than a late mail route, more than his own comfort or sense of control. The deeper he went, the more the town's sounds disappeared. The hum of traffic, the buzz of lawn mowers, even the distant rumble of a freight train, all gone, swallowed by the canopy of sycamores and oaks. Henry wasn't used to silence. It made every crack of a twig feel like thunder. He kept moving, swatting bugs and muttering under his breath, "If I get fired for this, you better be worth it, Mutt." He'd lost sight of the dog more than once, but every time he thought it was over, that the trail had gone cold, or he'd imagined the whole thing, there it was again. A flash of fur, a bark, a pause just long enough for him to catch up. It was leading him. No doubt about that anymore. What he didn't know, what was gnawing at the back of his brain like an itch he couldn't scratch, was why. Why would a stray dog bite a man only to beg him to follow? He thought back to the bite. Not deep, not feral. It wasn't like the dog was trying to attack him, more like it was desperate, like it didn't have time for niceties. Henry thought of his daughter for a moment, Kate, grown now, with a family of her own in Dayton. When she was little, she used to tug at his shirt if she saw something scary or exciting. This dog's bite reminded him of that. Urgent, wordless, needing help. The terrain grew rougher the farther he went. Pine needles blanketed the ground, hiding roots that nearly took him down more than once. The woods thinned slightly, enough for slivers of golden sunlight to break through and dance across the path like God's flashlight. He hadn't seen this part of Brookridge in years, maybe decades. A rusted "no trespassing" sign hung limp on a barbed wire fence post, half-eaten by vines. Beyond it, a narrow creek snaked its way downhill, trickling lazily between rocks and moss. Henry stopped to catch his breath. The heat was climbing, and the buzz of mosquitoes didn't help. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked around. Nothing. No barking. No dog. Just wind and trees. And then, faint, barely audible, the sound of something not quite natural. Not wind. Not animal. A whimper? He tilted his head, heart suddenly picking up speed. He turned to his left. Nothing but brush and trees. To his right, about 20 yards ahead, movement. There, the dog again. It had stopped near a gully, where rain had carved out a natural ditch, now mostly dry, with some leftover mud and leaves at the bottom. The dog barked again, but this time it didn't run. It stood perfectly still. Henry approached slowly. The closer he got, the more the smell of damp earth hit him. And something else. Something sour, like garbage left out in the heat. He stepped down the incline carefully, grabbing onto a sapling for balance, and finally reached the bottom. The dog stayed on the edge above him, watching. Down in the ditch, there was trash. Cans, plastic, soaked newspapers, likely runoff from nearby neighborhoods. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten pit. But then he saw it. A patch of pink. Cloth? Blanket? He squinted. No, not just cloth. Flesh. Small, pale, still. Henry's breath hitched. He moved faster than he thought his knees could handle. Slipping in mud. Heart pounding. He dropped to his knees and pulled back the blanket gently. There she was. A baby. Just a baby. Eyes closed, cheeks flushed. Her little fists trembling under the swaddle. "Oh my God," he whispered. The baby whimpered softly, barely a sound, like her tiny body had nearly given up on trying to be heard. She was alive, weak, but alive. His hands shook as he took off his mailman's jacket and wrapped her up, shielding her from the breeze. His phone was already in his hand. He dialed 911, trying to keep his voice steady as he rattled off their location. "Behind Timberlane Road," he said, glancing up at the dog. "Near the old hunting trail. There's a baby. I found a baby in a ditch." The dispatcher's voice grew tense. "Sir, stay there. Don't move. Help is on the way." He ended the call and looked down at the baby girl in his arms. She blinked once. Just once. It was enough. The dog let out a soft whine. Henry turned toward it. "You knew," he said aloud. "You knew she was here." The dog lay down, front paws over the ridge, resting its head like it had completed a job it was born to do. Time felt strange. Henry sat in that ditch, cradling the baby, talking to her softly about nonsense, baseball scores, the weather, anything to keep her alert. Minutes stretched long. He kept checking his watch, though he couldn't remember what time he got there anymore. When the sirens came, they felt like a dream. The ambulance lights flickered through the trees like lightning bugs, bouncing red and white off the wet bark. Voices shouted. Boots stomped. EMTs dropped beside him like angels. "She's alive," Henry said hoarsely. "She's okay." The paramedic checked vitals. Cold but stable. Damn lucky. Henry looked up at the edge. The dog was gone. He spent hours answering questions. Cops. Social workers, reporters. Everyone wanted the story. What he couldn't explain was the dog. No one had seen it leave. No one had gotten a photo. Just Henry's word, and the faint trace of paw prints near the ditch. By dusk, Henry was back home, his uniform ruined, his legs scratched up, but his spirit still spinning from the weight of it all. He sat on his porch, staring at the stars peeking through the clouds, when he heard it again. A soft, single bark. He turned. There, under the glow of the porch light, sat the dog. Dirty, calm, watching him. Henry stood, walked forward slowly. The dog didn't move. "You coming in?" he asked. And for the first time, the stray wagged its tail. The next morning started before sunrise. Not because Henry had to, but because sleep was a stranger that night. His mind had played the same reel over and over. The dog's bite, the chase, the ditch, the baby's tiny fists twitching beneath a crusted blanket. He'd called the post office to let them know he wouldn't be making deliveries that day, or maybe the next. For the first time in 22 years, his route could wait. The stray dog, now washed with warm water, oatmeal shampoo, and patience, was curled at the foot of Henry's recliner. He hadn't barked or whimpered once all night. just followed Henry into the house, drank a full bowl of water, and lay down like he'd always lived there. Henry looked over his cup of diner-style coffee, steam curling toward the ceiling fan, and shook his head slowly. "I should name you something," he said aloud. "Can't keep calling you Mutt." The dog opened one eye, as if listening, then closed it again. "Scout," Henry tried. "Oh, you look like a scout." The tail flicked once, then again. "Yeah, Scout it is." Later that morning, the doorbell rang. Henry opened the door to find Deputy Marla Skinner on his porch. She was young, probably mid-30s, always polite and brisk, with a voice that could calm drunks and stubborn farmers alike. She removed her aviators and gave him a nod. "Morning, Henry." "Morning, Deputy. You mind if I come in for a minute?" He stepped aside. "Sure, coffee's fresh." She stepped into the living room, gave Scout a cautious glance. He responded with nothing but a tail thump, then sat down on the edge of Henry's couch. "We got the test results back," she said. "From the hospital. The baby. She's stable, breathing on her own now, eating, crying, the whole deal." Henry exhaled hard, relief flooding his chest. "They're calling her Baby Jane until we figure out who she is." "No matches in the system?" Marla shook her head. "Nothing. No missing persons report, no recent births at nearby hospitals that line up. It's like she dropped out of the sky." Henry rubbed his temples. "And no note?" Marla hesitated. There was something, taped inside the blanket, just one line, written in shaky handwriting. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her inner jacket pocket, handed it to him. It read, "She deserves better." Henry stared at it for a long time. The words didn't explain much, but they said everything. "She was abandoned," he said quietly. "That's what it looks like." That night, the local news aired the story. It ran as the lead, "Mailman rescued abandoned baby with help from heroic stray." Henry didn't have cable, but his neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, called him within minutes. "They showed your face and everything," she said. "And the dog, too. I cried like a baby." By morning, there were flowers on his porch, cards, a letter from someone in Oregon who saw the clip online and wrote, "That dog's an angel, so are you." Scout, meanwhile, took it all in stride. He followed Henry around the house, curling up beside his boots when he sat on the porch, watching squirrels with military-level discipline. The neighborhood kids came by and asked if they could pet the rescue dog. Henry let them, as long as they were gentle. It felt good, all the attention, but also strange. Something gnawed at him, a question he couldn't shake. How did the dog know? How long had Scout been watching that baby? And what if he hadn't bitten Henry that day? A few days later, Henry decided to retrace his steps. He needed to see the ditch again, without adrenaline clouding his vision. He packed a thermos of coffee, brought Scout along, and drove down Timberlane Road, parking just shy of the wire fence that led into the woods. Scout jumped out of the truck like he knew the route by heart. The woods were quieter now, less mysterious. The birds chirped like normal. A couple of deer crossed their path, watching curiously before leaping away. Henry walked slowly, keeping his eyes peeled for anything he missed the first time. Scout led again, but this time more relaxed, like they were just going for a morning stroll. The ditch was still there, undisturbed, except for faded police tape marking the site. He stood on the edge and stared down at the spot where Baby Jane had lain. "What made you stop here?" he asked the dog. "You could have ignored her. Most would have." Scout sniffed the air, then turned and trotted off, just a few yards, but stopped in front of a tree stump and began pawing at the dirt. Henry watched, then followed. Scout scratched again, and something poked up from the ground. A cloth. No, a small satchel, tattered, mildewed, partially buried. Henry reached down and pulled it free. Inside, he found a cracked baby bottle, a pacifier, and a folded baby onesie. On it, the faint design of a smiling sunflower. His stomach tightened. This wasn't random. Someone had lived here, or at least hid here, long enough to need supplies. long enough to leave signs behind. Henry turned to Scout. "You were watching her, weren't you? For days, maybe longer." Scout didn't answer. He didn't need to. Henry packed the items carefully into a plastic bag and called Deputy Marla. She met him within an hour. "We'll check for fingerprints," she said. "Maybe DNA." She paused before she left. "You know, I think that dog's smarter than most of us." Henry glanced at Scout. "I'm starting to believe that." That evening, Henry sat on his porch again. Scout lay beside him, chin resting on Henry's worn-out boot. The stars came out one by one, and for once, the night felt still. He thought of baby Jane, alive, warm, safe, a future unwritten. And he thought of Scout, once a stray, now a hero, and maybe more human than half the folks he knew. Henry lifted his glass of iced tea and raised it slightly. "To the ones who don't need words to save a life." Scout thumped his tail once, quietly. And somewhere, in the soft hum of that American night, it felt like the beginning of something bigger than either of them. Henry Talbot wasn't one to meddle in other people's business. That's something his father had taught him early on. Deliver the mail, not the gossip. And for the better part of 22 years, he'd kept to that. Until now. He stood inside Brookridge Sheriff's Department, hands in his jacket pockets, the same jacket he'd used to swaddle that baby girl less than a week ago. The one he still hadn't washed. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it felt wrong. Maybe it felt sacred. Deputy Marla Skinner leaned against the reception counter with a folder in her hand. She looked tired, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, sleeves rolled up over a county-issued polo, a half-drunk coffee growing cold beside her. "I've got something," she said, tapping the file. Henry leaned in. "A name?" "No, but we've got movement." She opened the folder and pulled out a couple of photos, grainy, black and white, likely from a trail camera or an old security feed. In one, a woman with unkempt hair and a duffel bag was walking along the edge of a back road not far from the creek. The second image was even blurrier, but you could tell she was holding something, wrapped in a blanket. Maybe a baby. Maybe baby Jane. "She was seen 3 days before you found the infant," Marla said. "We don't have a clear ID, but a few people around East Ridge said she'd been sleeping behind the old bait shop. The owner thought she was homeless." Henry stared at the photo. "You think she's the mother?" Marla nodded slowly. "Or knows who is." He looked at Scout, who was curled beside the front desk like he belonged there. "He led me right to her," Henry muttered. "Right to that ditch." Marla looked down at Scout, then back at Henry. "Henry, dogs don't just randomly do this kind of thing. That dog didn't stumble on her. He was guarding her." Henry nodded. He was already there. He waited for someone to notice. She leaned in, which means he probably saw the person who left her too. Back at home, Henry couldn't shake the weight in his chest. Every time he looked at Scout, he didn't just see a dog. He saw a witness. A silent one, but a witness nonetheless. That night, after a dinner of leftover meatloaf and canned green beans, Henry pulled an old photo album from his bookshelf. Not because it had answers, but because he needed to remember who he was before all this. He flipped through pictures of his daughter Kate playing in the yard, his late wife Angela at a 4th of July picnic, Scout's empty dog bed in the corner. He closed the album, got up, and walked outside. Scout followed. "Where'd you come from, buddy?" Henry said, standing on the porch, hands on his hips. "Before all this, before me." Scout didn't make a sound. He walked down the steps, turned toward the road, and stopped, waiting. Henry squinted. "You want to go somewhere?" Scout barked once, low and short, and began walking. Henry grabbed his keys and flashlight. The road was dark. Country dark. The kind of darkness you only find between cornfields and woodlots, where streetlights run out and the stars take over. Scout led the way, nose low, tail still. He wasn't sniffing. He was guiding. They walked past the gas station, past the high school football field with the busted scoreboard, and into the outskirts of Brookridge, where the houses got smaller and the lawns turned to gravel. It was nearing midnight when Scout stopped at a chain-link fence. Henry recognized the place, the old bait shop. It had been closed for years. The owner passed away, and no one had taken it over. The wooden shed beside it was barely standing, its roof sagging like tired shoulders. Scout sat down outside it. "You've been here before," Henry said, stepping forward. He looked through a broken window. Inside, nothing but trash bags, rotted shelves, and a smell of mildew thick enough to taste. He turned and saw Scout staring at the dirt behind the building. "What is it?" Scout started pawing. Henry walked over, knelt beside him, and moved some of the topsoil. After a few minutes, he uncovered a shallow pit, once used for burning garbage, and in it, half buried, were scorched scraps of cloth and paper. He reached in carefully and pulled out a partially burned envelope. The name on it was barely legible, but he could make out the return address, Cleveland, OH. Inside the envelope was a photograph, partially melted at the corners, but still clear enough. A young woman, same face from the grainy security photo, holding a baby. Same pink blanket. The next morning, Henry brought everything straight to Marla. "That's her," she said. "That's gotta be her." They ran the return address and finally got a hit, an abandoned apartment on the east side of Cleveland. No active phone numbers, no utility usage, but a neighbor remembered a woman named Tessa who lived there briefly, pregnant and alone. Marla's voice dropped. "If this is our girl, she might be scared. Maybe running from something or someone." Henry looked at Scout. "And you? You followed her from Cleveland to Brookridge?" Marla raised an eyebrow. "That's over 2 hours away." "I know," Henry said. "That's what makes this so damn strange." By the end of the week, baby Jane had been placed in temporary foster care, safe, warm, and thriving. Social services were still looking for the mother, but the investigation had gone quiet again. Whoever Tessa was, she hadn't used her name since. No ID, no records, no social presence. But something about it didn't sit right with Henry. He started putting feelers out, talking to folks on his route, especially the ones near Timberlane and East Ridge. The folks who kept to themselves. The ones who saw things but didn't like to talk about them. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he just couldn't shake it. And then one afternoon, while walking Scout near the edge of town, he spotted a figure sitting alone on a park bench, hood pulled low, board hunched. Scout froze, then whimpered. Henry narrowed his eyes. "Tessa?" he called out gently. The woman turned, startled, and for a moment, just a flash, Henry saw the same eyes from the photo. She stood, started to run, but Scout moved first, not to chase, not to attack, just to block. He stood in front of her, tail low, eyes full of something unspoken. She stopped, fell to her knees, and wept. Tessa Hayes hadn't meant to stop. Her body did it before her mind caught up. One moment, she was preparing to flee, again. And the next, she was on her knees in front of the very man whose face she'd seen on the local news just days earlier. The mailman. The one who saved her baby. And the dog. That dog. The one that had followed her across 2 counties, who had kept her daughter safe when she couldn't. She couldn't look at him. Couldn't look at the dog, either. Tears came faster than words. For a long while, neither Henry nor Scout moved. The quiet in the small-town park felt almost too loud, too heavy. Just beyond the swing set, a little boy kicked a soccer ball, unaware of the quiet war unraveling on the bench. Tessa finally spoke, her voice rough and hollow. "I didn't mean to leave her like that." Henry crouched beside her, not too close. "Then tell me what happened." She sniffled, pulling her hoodie sleeves over her hands. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." They sat for a while. Scout curled at their feet like a soldier standing guard. Tessa began slowly, her voice flat, almost mechanical. "I was living in Cleveland, West Side. Things weren't good. I bounced around, stayed with a guy for a while. He got me pregnant. Then he got mean. Henry listened, his eyes steady, his heart heavier with every word. I tried to leave. He wouldn't let me. Not until one night. I waited till he passed out. I packed the baby in a backpack, walked 3 miles to a bus station. I didn't even have a plan. She laughed, bitter and tired. I got to Brookridge because I knew no one would know me here. I figured I could get a job at a diner or something. But with no ID, no money, and a baby, it was impossible. I was sleeping behind buildings, stealing diapers. I had 1 can of formula left. Henry spoke gently. You should have gone to a shelter. I tried. The only one that took in women with babies had a wait list. Said come back in 3 days. She shook her head. I didn't have 3 days. She paused, struggling to breathe through the weight in her chest. So I left her where someone could find her. Henry's voice cracked slightly. A ditch, Tessa? She looked at him, eyes raw. I left her wrapped up. I knew that dog would stay. He'd been following me for a week. I thought maybe he'd lead someone. Henry's jaw clenched. You were right. He did. They sat in silence again. Then Henry said something that surprised them both. You need to come with me. Tessa flinched. So you can call the cops? They'll find you anyway. And when they do, it'll matter that you turned yourself in. But first, I think you should see your daughter. Tessa blinked. She's okay? She's more than okay, but she needs more than safety. She needs answers. Tessa buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Scout, silently, rested his chin on her knee. The Brookridge County Family Services Building was a beige 2-story brick office that looked more like a DMV than a place where lives changed forever. Henry stood beside Tessa as they walked through the front doors, flanked by Deputy Marla, who had arrived just minutes before after Henry's quiet phone call. You sure about this? Marla asked him. Henry nodded. She needs a fair chance. Tessa sat in the waiting room like she might vanish at any moment. When the social worker finally called her in, Henry didn't follow. He sat beside Scout, watching through the glass as Tessa disappeared behind a wooden door. He didn't know what would happen in there, didn't know if Tessa would be arrested, or if she'd be granted supervised visits, or even if she'd be banned from seeing the baby entirely. But what he did know was this. She hadn't left her child out of hate. She'd left her out of fear. And sometimes, in small towns where everyone thinks they know better, that fear goes unnoticed. Tessa emerged an hour later. Her eyes were red, but something in her posture had changed. Less hunched, less brittle. They're going to let me see her once a week, she said quietly. Supervised for now. I don't get custody unless I can prove I've got housing, work, stability. Henry smiled softly. That's a start. She looked at him. Thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me. Thank him. He pointed to Scout, whose tail wagged faintly like he understood every word. Tessa knelt beside him. You knew, didn't you? You knew she needed help. Scout licked her hand, slow and deliberate. Back at home that evening, Henry poured himself a whiskey on the rocks and sat on the porch. Scout lay beside him, the wind rustling the porch flag overhead. The stars were just starting to blink into view. I've been a mailman for over 2 decades, Henry said aloud. I thought I'd seen it all. Junk mail, divorce papers, lottery checks, even love letters. But this? He looked down at Scout. You changed my whole damn life. Scout didn't respond. He just shifted his weight and let out a long, relaxed sigh. Henry chuckled. Maybe I ought to let you pick the next winning lottery numbers. The next morning, Henry received a call. It was from the local firehouse. A man named Walt Bishop had seen the news story and had a favor to ask. We're hosting an animal rescue fundraiser this weekend. Word is you've got the town's newest 4-legged hero. Think he'd mind showing up? Henry grinned. We'll be there. Saturday came bright and warm. The firehouse lawn was dotted with tents, hot dog stands, and kids running through bounce houses. There were booths for pet adoptions, face painting, and even a small photo tent titled Paws and Heroes. Scout, freshly brushed and proudly wearing a red bandana, stood beside Henry as waves of children came up to pet him, snap photos, and ask the same question over and over. "Is it true he saved a baby?" Henry always gave the same answer. "No, he led me. I just listened." Tessa came too, dressed in clean clothes, a backpack slung over her shoulder, her eyes looking forward instead of over them. She walked up to Henry, holding a sealed manila envelope. "This is all the paperwork I could pull together. I'm trying to apply for jobs." He smiled. "That's good, one step at a time." She looked at Scout, then at the crowd of kids gathering around him. "Isn't it crazy," she said, "how a dog can do something people couldn't?" Henry looked out over the firehouse yard. Parents laughing, volunteers cheering, dogs barking joyfully, and replied, "Maybe it's not crazy. Maybe that's what makes them special. They don't need a reason to help." That night, as Scout rested by the fireplace and Henry jotted some notes into a yellow legal pad, something he hadn't done in years, he stopped mid-sentence. He thought about all the stories he'd carried in envelopes, all the things he'd delivered, but nothing he'd ever held had mattered as much as that baby girl in his jacket, and nothing had ever found its way into his life like Scout. The courthouse in Brookridge wasn't exactly grand. It didn't have marble steps or brass railings. It was a red brick building tucked behind the public library, with mismatched chairs in the waiting area and a judge who drank his coffee from a paper cup labeled Number 1 Grandpa. But for Tessa Hayes, it might as well have been the Supreme Court. Henry sat in the back row that day, hat in his lap, Scout curled dutifully at his feet. The courtroom buzzed softly, neighbors whispering, reporters setting up mics, the sheriff nodding politely to the clerk. But Henry wasn't paying attention to any of that. His eyes were fixed on Tessa. She sat at the front of the courtroom, shoulders straighter than when he first met her, hair brushed, clothes clean, a notepad and pen resting in her lap. She'd spent the last 2 months doing everything the court had asked, working part-time at a bakery, staying at the women's shelter, attending counseling, never missing a single supervised visit. And now it all came down to this. The judge cleared his throat, looking down over his reading glasses. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "this custody hearing today is not about perfection. It's about potential. It's about the child's best interest, yes, but also about whether you've proven you are no longer a danger to your daughter." Tessa nodded, voice firm but calm. "Yes, Your Honor." Her lawyer stood and presented character statements, therapy reports, and employment logs. The social worker testified to her commitment, her growth, and her genuine bond with the baby during supervised time. Then the judge turned toward the back row. "Mr. Talbot," he said, "I understand you've been involved with this child's discovery and safety. Would you care to speak?" Henry stood slowly, brushing dust from his khakis. Scout remained behind, quiet and still. He walked to the front and took the oath, his voice steady. "I didn't come here today to make legal arguments," Henry said. "I'm a mailman, not a lawyer. But I've known hardship, and I've known redemption. And I believe in both." He paused. "When I first met Tessa, she was broken. But she never let go of that baby, not really. She left her with a guardian." The courtroom leaned in. "That stray dog? He didn't find the baby by accident. He stayed with her because Tessa had earned his trust. Animals know who we are before we do." He turned to Tessa, "And in my opinion, she's not running anymore. She's learning to stand still and take responsibility." The judge was silent for a moment, nodding. Then he spoke. "Effective today, Ms. Hayes is granted full reunification with her daughter, pending 6 months of in-home supervision." Gasps, then applause. Tessa cried, quiet, strong tears of relief, and turned toward Henry, who gave her a nod and a half-smile that said, "You earned this." Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, local press, even kids with hand-drawn signs that read, "Hero Dog" and "Scout Saves." Tessa emerged carrying her baby, now 7 months old, cheeks full, eyes bright, wrapped in the same pink blanket, washed and mended. Henry stood beside Scout as they approached. "She's beautiful," he said. Tessa nodded. "Her name's Hope." Henry smiled. "That fits." Scout stepped forward and sniffed Hope's tiny foot. She giggled and reached out, grabbing a tuft of his fur with surprising grip. He didn't flinch, just licked her fingers once, gently. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that day, but it became normal, which, for people like Tessa and Henry, was even better. Tessa rented a small studio near Main Street. She worked mornings at the bakery and spent afternoons with Hope in the park. The town that once watched her with suspicion began to nod at her with recognition, and then respect. Henry returned to his mail route. Folks waved more often now. Kids left drawings of Scout in the mailbox. One even mailed Henry a dog treat wrapped in foil with a note that said, "For your partner." Scout became a local legend. The sheriff's department gave him a little badge that said, "Canine Honorary Hero," which Henry hung on the dog's collar. Every Saturday morning, Scout walked with Henry to the farmer's market, where old men tipped their caps and kids lined up for photos. But Henry knew the real story wasn't about a dog saving a baby. It was about a dog who saw the good in people, even when they didn't see it in themselves. One Friday night, Henry sat on the porch swing, Scout curled at his feet, crickets singing into the darkness. Tessa pulled up in her old Buick, parked across the street, and stepped out with Hope on her hip. Henry waved them over. They sat together under the porch light, sipping sweet tea and watching Hope try to pet Scout's ears. She missed and got his nose instead. He didn't mind. "You ever think about why he followed you?" Henry asked Tessa. She thought for a second. "Maybe he saw something in me I didn't. Maybe he knew I wanted help, even when I didn't know how to ask." Henry nodded. "I think he's been helping people a long time. You're just the one who finally listened." Tessa smiled. "Guess that makes us both lucky." That night, Henry stood by the screen door as they drove away. Scout sat beside him, watching the car's taillights disappear into the quiet. Henry looked down. "You done good, partner." Scout wagged his tail once, then lay down with a soft sigh. Weeks passed, then months. Hope took her first steps in the park. Tessa enrolled in night classes, and Henry kept delivering the mail. One day, a letter arrived at Henry's house, addressed only to the man who followed the dog. Inside was a handwritten note. "Some heroes don't bark. They walk beside us quietly. Thank you for being one of them. A grateful town." Henry smiled and taped it to the fridge, right next to a photo of Scout, standing beside a judge, and a mother holding her baby under a banner that read, "Hope found here." Thank you for following this story. If you were moved by the journey of Scout, Henry, and Tessa, we invite you to subscribe to Heroes for Animals, where we share real and inspired stories of the animals who remind us what loyalty, love, and second chances look like. Let us ask you something. Have you ever met an animal that seemed to understand more than they should? We'd love to hear your story in the comments.